Have you ever noticed that sometimes the hardest blows don't come from enemies but from our own family? It hurts more because it's not just an insult. It's a silent betrayal from the very people who should be the foundation of our respect. The day my son, in front of everyone, told me I wasn't worthy, it wasn't just my heart that broke. It felt like an entire lifetime of sacrifices, sleepless nights, and promises kept had turned to dust in a matter of seconds. But life has its paradoxes. The more they try to humiliate us, the more they push us to discover a strength we never knew we had. And it was in that very humiliation that I found my liberation. Because in that moment, while he laughed at my pain, I silently made a decision that would change everything. I would sell the house worth $890,000. Sounds crazy? Maybe. But sometimes you have to flip the table in such an unexpected way that the whole world is left speechless. Before I continue this story, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and hit subscribe. Because here, every story is more than entertainment. It's a reminder that respect within a family isn't a luxury, it's a right. It was supposed to be just another Sunday lunch, one of those gatherings that seem ordinary, but deep down carry the symbolic weight of family bonds. The table was full, roast fresh out of the oven, wine glasses clinking, conversations weaving between old memories and small jokes. I looked at it all and thought, this is why all the sacrifice is worth it. Until suddenly, the air shifted, as if someone had pulled the plug on the room's energy. Every voice went silent. The reason? My own son Daniel, staring straight at me and, in front of neighbors, friends, and co-workers, saying the words that still echo in my mind. Dad, you are not worthy of respect. I don't know if you've ever gone through something like that, but it's a feeling that freezes you. It's like standing in front of a crowd and suddenly having your clothes ripped off. A raw, unfair, disproportionate exposure. I sat there motionless, staring at the plate in front of me, feeling the food go cold while the whole world seemed to burn. In that moment, all the effort I had put into teaching values, preserving dignity, and building a family based on respect seemed swallowed whole by a single sentence. What hurt the most wasn't the insult itself. It was the betrayal hidden inside it. Because when criticism comes from strangers, it stings, but it doesn't cut as deep. When it comes from your own child, it's like something inside your soul shatters. And there was one more detail that made the humiliation even worse: the audience. Have you ever noticed how heavy people's eyes feel in moments of shame? These weren't just words said in the heat of a private argument. They were words thrown in front of everyone. Nervous chuckles stopped, forks froze midair, glasses halted halfway through a toast. The collective silence became an accomplice to my humiliation. I could feel the weight of their stares on my skin, as if each one was asking, is it true? Does this father not deserve respect? That kind of invisible judgment can eat away at anyone's dignity. But surprisingly, I didn't explode. I didn't fire back. I didn't yell, slam the table, or cry. I just swallowed hard and stayed quiet. Does that sound like weakness? No. In that moment, it was the beginning of a silent revenge. I've learned that there are moments when words spoken in anger can become a prison forever. A rushed response is like throwing gasoline on a fire. It makes noise, but it burns everything down. By choosing silence, I wasn't giving up. I was protecting something far more valuable, my own dignity. Maybe you've been through something similar. A meeting where someone questioned your competence. A dinner where someone mocked your appearance. A party where your own family made you the target. In those moments, the urge to fight back is overwhelming. But take a deep breath with me. Haven't you noticed that many times silence disarms more than any word? I remember once years ago a client yelled at me in front of other workers. I just listened, took notes on what he was saying, and when he was done, I calmly replied, "Understood. Let's fix it." The result? The others respected me more for my composure than if I had yelled back. The same principle applies to family life. Of course, the emotion doesn't, just disappear. Inside me, there was a storm, betrayal, pain, the weight of years of effort being spit back in my face. But along with it, a flame was lit, a flame I call liberation. Because when someone wounds us like that, they also give us the chance to rebuild ourselves differently. It was as if, by denying my worth, my son had pushed me to prove, not to him, but to myself, that my value doesn't depend on anyone's approval. Dignity, I realized, lives inside us. And right there, in that suffocating silence that seemed to stretch on forever, something began to form inside me. Not yet a full plan, but a certainty. I would not let that moment pass as just another insult. It would not become just another unpleasant Sunday. It had to mean something bigger. Funny how life works. Sometimes it's precisely in humiliation that the most transformative decisions are born. I stayed quiet, yes, But in my mind, I was already writing the first line of a silent revenge. I sat there, staring at my plate, not even sure if what was in front of me was food or stone. My son's words still hammered in my head like a crooked nail refusing to go in. You are not worthy of respect. It's strange how a single sentence can shrink us in front of everyone, reducing the figure of a father to something almost invisible. Suddenly, I wasn't the man who had built, with his own hands, the house worth nearly $900,000 where he grew up. I wasn't the man who spent nights pouring concrete in silence, or the one who got up early on freezing mornings just to keep the bills paid. To him, I was nothing but a burden. And you know what hurts? It's not just the betrayal itself. It's the ingratitude disguised as modern thinking. Nowadays, so many children look at their parents as if they're outdated, relics that get in the way of the present. They forget that every brick of their present was laid by the hands they now despise. And in that moment, I felt something deeper than humiliation. I felt like I had become invisible in the very family I had built. Like an old black and white photograph stuffed in a drawer. It still exists, but no one looks at it. As I stared down at my plate, memories rushed through me like a movie playing too fast. I saw myself younger, holding Daniel in my arms, proud of every one of his accomplishments. I remembered the first bike he ever got, the one I assembled piece by piece late into the night. I recalled the time he called me a hero because I fixed the roof during a storm. Hero. How does a hero suddenly become someone unworthy of respect? The contrast between those memories and the present was like salt rubbed into an open wound. Maybe you've been through something like this, giving your all to someone, only to realize one day that your presence no longer carries any weight. It's like working for years at a company, and on the day you leave, no one even says a word, or pouring yourself into a relationship and the other person acts as if you never did a thing. The feeling is always the same. Invisibility. That's the most silent kind of betrayal, and for that reason, the cruelest. Because no one yells, no one slams doors, no one tears up papers. It's simply the cold realization that you're no longer seen. And yet, while the pain burned inside me, something began to clear. You know that saying, sometimes it's in the silence that we hear the loudest truth. That's exactly how it felt. Quiet as I was, I began to remember the value I had forgotten in myself. I looked at that house, the same house appraised at $890,000, and realized it wasn't just cement, wood, and roof. It was living proof of my effort, my sweat, my respect for what I called dignity. And if, for my son, it had become nothing more than a luxury property, for me, it was still a symbol of struggle. Funny how things connect. In that moment, I remembered a promise I made to myself years ago when I first bought the land. I swore I'd make that soil into a home that would outlast me, a place for generations. That promise became a beacon, guiding me through every overtime shift, every sleepless night, every sacrifice. But looking at Daniel, I realized that, for him, that legacy had no meaning anymore. To him, it was just a number, just status. That's when a question struck me like lightning. Why keep something that means nothing to the very person who should value it most? And maybe you need to ask yourself the same thing. How many times do you keep carrying dead weight just because you think it's the right thing to do? How many times do you hold on to something that's no longer appreciated? It might be a relationship, a job, a project. The truth is, respect and gratitude can't be demanded. They can only be given. And when they don't come freely, nothing can force them into existence. As painful as that realization is, it's also freeing. Because once you understand that, you stop seeing yourself as a victim of ingratitude and start seeing yourself as the owner of your own choices. And it was right there, in the middle of pain and silence, that the idea began to grow. I didn't yet know what I would do, but I knew one thing. I couldn't go on living as the invisible father. If I stayed that way, I'd be teaching my family that it was acceptable to treat me without respect. I'd be reinforcing the idea that dignity is disposable. And no, that wasn't the inheritance I wanted to leave behind. So, without saying a word but with the decision already taking shape inside me, I left that lunch. I walked out early. I didn't stay for dessert, didn't say goodbye to everyone. I just left. And every step I took whispered, it's time to turn this page. That night when I got home, the silence felt heavier than the noise I had left behind at lunch. I didn't turn on the TV, didn't put on music, didn't want to talk to anyone. I just sat in the office chair, staring at the bookshelf. It was as if every book, Every object there carried a piece of my story. And then my eyes stopped on a folder of documents. Inside it was the contract for the house. Along with it, the memory of the promise I made to myself the day I bought that land, to build not just walls and a roof, but a home that would last for generations. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was much younger, full of dreams and debt at the same time. Back then, people called me crazy. A lot in that neighborhood? You'll bury yourself in bills. But I had a conviction inside me that no one could erase. The ground was still raw mud, but where others saw weeds and rocks, I saw a house. It was there, with my boots sinking in the dirt, that I told myself, I'll build a home. My family will grow here. This will be our future. That promise gave me strength when my body begged for rest, when the bills felt heavier than the concrete I carried. Every brick I laid in that house told a story. It wasn't just construction. It was sweat turned into dignity. I remember the first wall that stood tall, painted white with your mother's help, laughing while I tried to cover the flaws in the plaster. The first doors that banged in the wind, I fixed them myself. And that heavy gate, the one Daniel swung open so many times after school, I adjusted it so it would never jam. Everything there carried my mark. More than that, everything there was living proof of the promise I made. But looking back now, I realized something painful. The promise had been broken, not by me, but by the one who should have carried it forward. Daniel no longer saw the value in any of it. To him, the house was nothing more than a property worth $890,000, a status symbol, a showcase, an inheritance in advance. Where I saw love, he saw dollar signs. Where I saw dignity, he saw display. And that hurt me even more than his insult, because it wasn't just about one phrase spoken at lunch. It was the realization that the legacy itself had never been understood. And I asked myself, how often do we live this way? We work, we sacrifice nights, we invest in education, in family, in values, only to discover one day that the very people we fought for don't see any of it. It's like handing someone a rare book, only for them to use its pages to light a fire. The betrayal, in these cases, isn't just in the open disrespect. It's in the silent, almost indifferent lack of recognition. And that indifference can be even crueler than outright contempt. That's when I began to think differently. I could keep carrying a promise alone, but did it make sense? Was it fair to hold something up just because I once swore I would? Maybe true freedom wasn't in protecting the house at all costs, but in realizing that promises can change shape too. After all, life isn't static, and when a promise stops serving its purpose, maybe that's the sign it's time to transform it into something else. In that moment, I looked again at the property contract. That paper, which for years had symbolized security, suddenly began to represent something new. It wasn't just ownership, it was power. Power to decide, power to shape a future that was still in my hands. I didn't have to stay chained to a symbol no one valued anymore. I could redefine what that promise meant, and in that thought, something began to grow inside me. Maybe it was time to use that house to teach a bigger lesson, not with shouting, not with blame, but with an action capable of flipping the game. And if you think about it, maybe you've already lived something similar. It could be that moment when you realize the college major you chose no longer makes sense, even after years invested, or when you notice the relationship you poured yourself into doesn't carry the same value anymore. In those moments, we need courage to rewrite promises. It's not about throwing the past away. It's about transforming it. It's about saying, everything I did until now mattered, but from here on, I'll walk a different path. That was exactly the feeling that began to take root in me that night. And when I closed my eyes, I could almost hear the metallic zipper of the folder opening. It felt like a period, or maybe a comma, something that clears the way for the next chapter. I didn't know how yet, but I was already decided that promise wouldn't be buried, it would be transformed. And that transformation, I could already feel, would be more powerful than any speech I could ever give. When I walked out of my son's house that Sunday, there was no fight, no heated speech. I simply stood up from the table, ate half my plate, and under the curious eyes of everyone around, I left in silence. You know that silence that weighs heavier than 1,000 words? That was it. It wasn't cowardice. It was restraint. Inside, I was boiling, but I had learned long ago that some battles aren't won at the dinner table with shouting and accusations. They're won later, after the dust settles, on the battlefield of unexpected decisions. And it was in that silence that I began to build my response. When I got home, the night felt colder than usual. I shut the door slowly, as if I didn't want to wake up old memories. I took off my shoes at the entrance and walked into the office. The sound of that metallic zipper echoed in the room like a contained thunderclap. Funny how small sounds can carry such meaning. That zipper wasn't just a detail. For me, it was the marker of a new chapter. It was as if it whispered, "That's enough. Now it's my turn to write this story." I opened the folder and pulled out the property papers. There was the deed, receipts from renovations, payment records. Every page held a memory. I ran my hand over the documents the way you'd caress an old diary, and as I flipped through those sheets, I remembered something that struck me in my youth. A foreman once told me, "Paper is the weapon of the wise." Back then, I didn't understand. But in that moment, holding the deed in my hands, I realized I was holding the most powerful weapon I could use, and I wouldn't need to raise my voice to fire it. Silence, which many confuse with weakness, became my ally. Have you noticed how, in family conflicts, the one who talks too much usually loses themselves? The one who stays quiet, though, keeps their power. Because silence creates expectation, and expectation is the fuel of revenge. I could have fought back in that moment, but it would have been just another Sunday fight, forgotten by Monday. What I was preparing, however, no one would ever forget. I've seen it in business too. The ones who answer too fast usually lose the deal. The ones who wait, observe, and strike at the right time win. I spent that night wide awake, sitting in that worn-out chair in my office. There wasn't uncontrolled rage. There was something greater, clarity. It's incredible how sometimes when we're humiliated, the mind suddenly opens, space to see possibilities that were hidden before. Betrayal hurts, yes, but it also sets you free, because it cuts false ties and forces you to see life from a different angle. In that moment I realized I was no longer the father begging for respect. I was becoming the man who would choose how and where to place the value of his life. The next morning, with eyes still red from a sleepless night, I decided to act. I picked up the phone and called Stephen, my trusted realtor. He went silent for a few seconds after hearing my request. "I want to put the house on the market immediately." It was as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. "William, are you sure? That house carries more history than money. It's your legacy." I took a deep breath and replied, "If I'm not worthy of respect inside it, then it's not a home anymore. It's just a house, and a house can be sold." It's funny how people always call our decisions madness when they don't understand the pain behind them. Stephen couldn't see what I felt. He wasn't at the table when I was exposed. He didn't hear the cutting words that reduced me to dust in front of everyone. And how could I explain that? I couldn't, so I didn't. I just told him to move forward with the process. Sometimes explaining is just wasting time. In certain situations, the best explanation is the action itself. And maybe you need to hear this too. Not everything has to be explained. You don't always need to justify why you made a certain choice, especially when it comes from your dignity. If you feel you need to change jobs, move cities, leave a relationship, you won't always have arguments that others will understand, but you will have an inner reason strong enough to carry your choice. And that's exactly how I felt at that moment. It wasn't about convincing anyone. It was about reclaiming my voice, not with words, but with action. I closed the folder again, but this time the zipper didn't sound like a period. It sounded like a springboard. I knew that gesture would change everything, and not just for me, but for everyone around me. Because when a man betrayed and humiliated decides to rise in silence, he never goes back to being the same. I already knew. The next Sunday would not be like the others. Stephen looked at me with a mix of disbelief and pity when we met at his office. I remember the skeptical shine in his eyes, like someone watching a man about to do something foolish. He leaned his elbows on the desk, clasped his hands together, and asked again, "William, are you sure? This house carries more history than money. It's almost a part of you." For a moment, I stayed quiet. Then, locking eyes with him, I replied, "Stephen, sometimes we have to let go of what we built so we don't fall apart inside." It was the first time I said out loud what had been pounding in my chest. At first, he tried to talk me out of it. He brought up the emotional value, the family dinners, the Christmases around the fireplace. He even mentioned the real estate market possibly shifting, urging me to wait. But my mind was made up. Dignity cannot be put up for auction. To others, it looked like a rash decision. To me, it was an act of liberation. It felt like taking an enormous weight off my shoulders. It wasn't the house itself I needed to get rid of, but what it had come to symbolize: betrayal, humiliation, the absence of respect. In less than 2 weeks, the visits began. A good property doesn't stay on the market long. People walked through the hallways, admired the kitchen I had remodeled myself, touched the walls I had built with my own hands. And you know, there was a bittersweet feeling inside me, both pain and pride. It was like giving a child up for adoption. It hurt to see strangers imagining their lives there. But at the same time I thought, at least someone will value what was built. The house was no longer a symbol of family, but it could still become someone else's dream fulfilled. Watching the negotiations was strange. Every time Stephen called with updates, I felt a mix of anxiety and calm. Anxiety, because it meant closing one of the biggest chapters of my life. Calm, because I knew I was on the right path. Offers came quickly. In less than 15 days, there was a solid buyer ready to pay cash. The man, a young doctor newly married, spoke about raising kids there, about planting trees in the yard, and in that instant, I realized the promise I made years ago, to build a home that would last for generations. Maybe it wouldn't live on in my family, but it would still live on. It would simply change owners. While the papers were being prepared, I found myself reflecting on how life works. Sometimes we believe legacy is something fixed, something that must be passed down exactly as we imagined. But in truth, legacy is fluid. It can change shape, flow into other hands, even be reborn in unexpected places. What matters is not who enjoys it, but that its original purpose is not lost. I wanted that house to be a symbol of respect and dignity. If it no longer meant that for Daniel, then it would be for someone capable of recognizing its value. Of course, it wasn't easy. There were nights when I wandered alone through the rooms, running my hand along the walls, remembering every detail. I remember standing in the main living room, where the sunset light poured through the curtains, and thinking, how many conversations, how many dreams, how many moments of joy and tears were lived here. It was impossible not to feel emotional, but it was just as impossible to ignore the pain of that last scene with my son. It was as if every wall echoed the insult he threw at me. I had to break that cycle somehow. Stephen called me on the day of the signing and asked, "William, are you ready?" I answered with a calm I didn't even expect from myself. More than ever, and I truly was. When I sat in front of the contract, pen in hand, I felt something close to relief. It wasn't just a sale, it was a silent declaration, a message that said, if I am not worthy of respect, then I am not obligated to carry the weight of indifference. I signed each page without hesitation, and with each signature, it felt as if another chain had been broken. And here's a lesson worth remembering. Sometimes we have to let go of what we built with so much effort in order to save something even more important, our dignity. It could be selling a house, ending a relationship, leaving a job where there is no respect. It hurts, yes, but it also sets you free, because when you place your dignity above everything else, you begin to rebuild yourself. At the end of that day, when I put away my copy of the contract, I didn't just feel loss, I felt movement. It was as if life had suddenly opened a new door, a blank page ready to be filled. I knew the next step would be even harder, telling Daniel, and deep down, I already sensed his reaction would be explosive. The following Sunday, I went back to Daniel's house, not out of desire, but out of necessity. I knew I needed to face the moment head on. When I rang the bell, I could hear voices coming from the living room, laughter, music in the background, the smell of food. It was one of those gatherings that, in other times, would have filled me with pride, but now it was just the stage for the truth I carried with me. I stepped inside and noticed the atmosphere was light, as if nothing had happened the week before. It's strange how those who wound others sometimes believe the victim's silence is forgetfulness, but it wasn't forgetfulness. It was preparation. Daniel greeted me with that automatic, almost formal smile. He shook my hand as if to show everything was fine, but his eyes revealed the same arrogance as always. I sat down and for a few minutes tried to play along. They asked about my health, about how the workshop was doing, and I answered briefly, but inside, I knew. I wasn't there for a family lunch. I was there to open the box he least expected. And when the mood seemed at its most relaxed, I cleared my throat, placed my hands on the table and said, with the calm of someone who had rehearsed every word, I sold the house. It's no longer ours. The silence was immediate. Conversations died. All eyes turned to me like headlights in the dark. Daniel went pale. His first reaction was disbelief. He laughed as if it were a bad joke, but when he realized I wasn't laughing, his eyes widened. What? Dad, are you insane? That house was our legacy. The word our sounded strange, almost cynical. Our? Where was this our when he disrespected me in front of everyone? Where was this our when he reduced me to nothing? It's fascinating to watch how people react when power shifts. Until then, he believed the future was guaranteed, that the property, appraised at $890,000, would inevitably be his, like a trophy waiting. on the shelf. Suddenly he realized he had no control at all. The shock wasn't just in the sale of the house. It was in realizing that the man he thought was fragile still held the reins of the story. The humiliation he had tried to impose on me that day now came back at him. While Daniel raged, I remained calm. I looked at him with serenity and said, "You speak of legacy, but you forgot that legacy isn't about property. It's about respect. If I am not worthy of that, then I am not needed. The house now belongs to someone who knows how to value it." My voice did not tremble, and I can tell you this: few things are as powerful as the composure of someone who has already decided. Because anger shouts, but truth speaks softly, and in that moment, my truth echoed louder than his outburst. Olivia, my daughter-in-law, tried to intervene. "But William, think of the grandchildren. Think of the family." Family. The word almost made me laugh inside. Where was family when they treated me like deadweight? Family isn't just blood, it's mutual respect, and I could no longer carry the burden of holding together something that no longer existed. I remember answering her gently but firmly. I did think of them, and it was precisely because of them that I made this decision. Because values aren't taught with speeches, but with examples. At that moment, I noticed the room was split. Some relatives looked at me with shock, others with quiet admiration. My daughter Grace couldn't hold back her tears. She had always been more sensitive, but in that moment, something in her changed. I saw in her eyes not only sadness, but understanding. She didn't say anything yet, but her gaze seemed to tell me, "Dad, I understand," and somehow that look became my fuel to stand firm. Daniel, on the other hand, was out of control. He paced the room, ran his hands through his hair, slammed his palm on the table. "You can't have done this. That house was for us, for our kids. You've destroyed everything." Funny how the ones who despise are always the first to scream when they lose. I just took a deep breath and thought, maybe now he'll understand that nothing is eternal when there is no respect. I didn't answer his accusations. Sometimes silence is the loudest reply. And maybe this is the lesson for those listening. The real shock doesn't come when you shout back, but when you show, through action, that you don't need anyone's approval to make decisions about your own life. It's a kind of revenge that doesn't require weapons or open hatred. It's the silent revenge of turning humiliation into liberation. I didn't need to prove anything with words. I had already proven it with action. That Sunday, I watched the mask fall. The arrogant man, so confident in his future, suddenly stood vulnerable, shaken, lost. And I, the man who had been treated as invisible, became once again the center of the scene. But not out of hollow pride. Rather, because for the first time, I showed everyone that respect is not a luxury, it is a right. And those who don't know how to give it don't deserve to receive it. I knew that moment required more than silence. Until then, my decisions had spoken for me. But there was something stuck in my throat ever since that fateful lunch when Daniel humiliated me. I had to return the words, not with the poison of anger, but with the clarity of truth. So, in the middle of the chaos of voices, I raised my hand, asking for calm. The noise slowly faded. Daniel looked at me, still trembling, his eyes red with indignation, and that's when I said, "You said I wasn't worthy of respect. If I'm not worthy, then I'm not needed. The house now belongs to someone who knows how to value it." Those words landed like a bolt of lightning from a clear sky. No shouting, no scandal, just the force of a simple but definitive statement. It's incredible how a few words, when spoken with dignity, have the power to turn the entire game around. Daniel was speechless. His mouth opened as if to respond, but nothing came out. Maybe because deep down he knew the truth was right there, raw and undeniable. The same man he once called unworthy now stood before everyone, showing the strength of someone who refuses to be diminished. Grace, my daughter, couldn't hold back. Tears rolled silently down her face, and I could see she was trying to hide them so as not to draw attention. But it was too late. Everyone saw, and in those tears there was more than just emotion. There was regret. She hadn't defended me on the day of the insult. She had stayed quiet out of fear of conflict. Now, every tear seemed to say, "Dad, I failed, but now I understand." And that understanding, even in silence, was like a balm for me. Because when a wound opens inside a family, sometimes all it takes is one genuine gesture to start the healing. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed to unravel. His usual arrogance had no room to breathe. He still tried one last card. "But, Dad, how could you? That house was what kept our history alive. You didn't think of the future, of the grandchildren." It was almost ironic to hear that. The same man who had reduced me to nothing was now talking about history, legacy, and family. I couldn't help but reply, with the calm that only clarity brings. History is preserved with respect, not with walls. Legacy isn't bricks, it's values. And if there's no respect, there's no inheritance that can hold it up. The room grew uncomfortable. Some shifted in their seats, others lowered their eyes. Because deep down, everyone knew this wasn't just about a house. It was about values. It was about dignity. It was about how family bonds don't survive on possessions, but on mutual respect. And there, in front of everyone, I showed that the betrayal and humiliation I endured wouldn't be buried in silence. They would be transformed into a lesson, perhaps the greatest lesson I could leave my children. And here's something I've learned, something worth sharing. Sometimes life forces us to choose between attachment and liberation. Attachment keeps us tied to things that have already lost their meaning. Liberation requires courage, but it creates space for something new. My words weren't just a reply to Daniel. They were an act of liberation for me. Because in saying I wasn't needed, I was also declaring that I would no longer be a prisoner of anyone's expectations. That was my silent revenge, transforming pain into autonomy. What struck me most was realizing, in that moment, that my voice carried a weight I hadn't felt in years. For so long, I had been the father who sacrificed in silence, the man who said yes to avoid conflict, the builder who did more than he spoke. But when I uttered those words, I felt my dignity rise in full voice again. And anyone who has ever been humiliated knows, few things are as powerful as reclaiming your own voice. It's like breathing again after being underwater for too long. While I spoke, there was no room for interruption. Even Olivia, my daughter-in-law, who always had something to say, stayed silent. The weight of my words hung in the room, and in that moment, I understood. I didn't need to shout to be heard. I just had to be true. I just had to speak with a heart full of dignity. Because in the end, the respect we long for from others always begins within ourselves. And then, almost without meaning to, I let out a brief, barely noticeable smile, not of mockery, not of victory over my son, but of relief. Because I knew those words would not be forgotten. They weren't just a response, they were a turning point. From that moment on, nothing would be the same. And at the same time, I also knew the biggest surprise was still to come, because the fate of the money from the house sale would not only complete the lesson, but place Daniel face to face with an even harsher truth. The silence after my words still lingered when I decided to reveal the part no one expected. Daniel assumed the house would be his. Olivia imagined enjoying its comforts, and some relatives might have already made their own plans for that property. But what they didn't know was that I hadn't sold it just to cut a tie. I had a greater purpose, and it was time to share it. I took a deep breath, looked at everyone, and said, I didn't use the money for myself. I made a donation, and the rest I put in Lily's name. The reaction was immediate. Shocked faces, stunned looks, silence heavier than any scream. The first part of the money was donated to families dreaming of their first home. People who, like I once did, looked at bare land and stones but carried the hope of building a future. To some, it might sound crazy to give away so much money, but to me, it was the closing of a cycle. What began as a promise of home didn't need to die as a luxury property. It could be reborn as opportunity for others. The liberation I sought wasn't in keeping, it was in giving back. And as I spoke, I saw in some relatives' eyes a mixture of respect and incomprehension. Because deep down, very few people understand that dignity isn't in hoarding, but in sharing. The second part of the money went to Lily, my granddaughter. She had always been the only one to look at me with genuine affection, without filters of interest or arrogance. How many times had she sat beside me to hear old stories while the others didn't even notice I was there? How many times had she hugged me slowly, without rush, as if she understood that affection isn't measured in possessions? Putting the trust fund in her name wasn't just a financial decision. It was a message. Respect is rewarded. Ingratitude fades into the wind. It was my way of teaching with a concrete example that family relationships aren't measured by pretty words, but by consistent actions. When Daniel heard his daughter's name, his face turned red, first with anger, then with shame. It was as if a mirror had been, placed in front of him. The same man who so often treated me as invisible now saw that his own daughter had been recognized for what he had never been able to give, genuine respect and affection. He tried to protest, stumbled through broken sentences, but his voice no longer carried weight, because, deep down, he knew. He knew Lily had given me what he denied, and in the end, that's what shaped my decision. And here's something I want you to remember. The true value of an inheritance is not in the money itself, but in the lesson it carries. Many believe inheritance is only about property, but in reality, it's about values. When you choose who will receive the fruits of your life, you're saying much more than who gets to enjoy it. You're saying, who deserves to continue this story? In my case, I didn't want my story to be remembered for betrayal and humiliation. I wanted it remembered for justice, respect, and dignity. Olivia, my daughter-in-law, nearly dropped her glass when she heard it. The room froze. Some were outraged. Others were impressed, but I stayed calm, because this was the essence of the silent revenge I had prepared, turning pain into a lesson. I didn't yell, didn't curse, didn't slam the door. I simply showed, through concrete actions, that those who fail to value lose, and those who respect win. It was my way of giving back double what had been taken from me, not just dignity, but also control of my own story. And maybe you, listening to this now, need to reflect. What kind of inheritance are you leaving behind? I'm not just talking about money or property, but about attitudes, values, and examples. Inheritance isn't only about what goes into someone's pocket. It's about what stays in their memory. How many parents leave behind fortunes, but with them leave bitterness, rivalries, broken families? I chose not to leave that kind of trail. My choice was meant to provoke, yes, but also to teach. Because if the money I built with sweat could be transformed into education, respect, and opportunity, then it had fulfilled its purpose. In the end, while Daniel twisted in rage and Grace watched me silently, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: lightness. Because finally, I no longer carried the weight of a broken promise, nor of the humiliation I had endured. I had made a decision that spoke for me, without needing to raise my voice. And I knew, with the same certainty I had when I signed the sale papers, that this act would mark not only their lives, but mine as well. Daniel had always behaved as if the world revolved around him. Imported cars, luxury trips, parties that felt like competitions in extravagance. Olivia, his wife, played her role like a queen on parade, flaunting expensive handbags and looks of superiority. They believed that lifestyle was guaranteed, sustained by the shadow of the $890,000 house and the idea that one day they would inherit everything I had built. But a single signature was enough to dismantle that illusion. When I told them about the sale and where the money had gone, their sandcastle began to collapse. At first, there was denial. Daniel insisted I couldn't have done it, that the family needed the house, that I had betrayed the blood we shared. Strange to hear the word betrayal from his mouth, when I was the one betrayed, humiliated in front of everyone. But soon denial turned into anger. There were shouts, doors slamming, accusations hurled at me and at Grace, who wept quietly in the corner. Olivia wasn't far behind. She complained about the vacations that wouldn't happen anymore, the fancy dinners that were now out of reach. It was as if, for the first time, they were forced to face real life, and they didn't like what they saw. The days that followed were an avalanche of conflict. I heard from neighbors and relatives that fights had become routine in their home. The absence of a guaranteed future shook them more than any words ever could. Without the prospect of inheritance, the cracks in their marriage began to show. Olivia accused Daniel of not standing up for himself. Daniel shouted that she only cared about money. Doors slammed, the grandchildren cried, and the seemingly untouchable atmosphere in that house fell apart. It was the slow but inevitable collapse of the arrogance that had once belittled me. And here's something important. When someone builds their life only on status, all it takes is pulling the rug to reveal the emptiness underneath. That's what happened. Daniel and Olivia discovered that respect cannot be bought with a new car or a trip overseas. When the admiration of others no longer came from the luxury they displayed, they tasted the bitterness of loneliness. Without the house as their symbol, they realized nothing was holding up their facade anymore. What remained were the words they once threw at me like stones, now echoing back in the emptiness. I didn't need to lift a finger. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to take cruel revenge. Life itself took care of showing that humiliation turns into downfall when respect isn't the foundation. And for me, there was an almost poetic irony in that. The man who told me I wasn't worthy of respect was now fighting to hold on to a shred of dignity in his own home. The revenge wasn't in the money spent, but in the lesson made clear. Those who don't value the essential will end up losing even the superficial. This part of the story taught me something worth sharing. Often, the most powerful act of revenge is simply walking away. When you take from someone the security that enabled their arrogance, they're forced to look at themselves in the mirror. No shouting can hold up that reflection. No excuse can hide the truth. Daniel and Olivia were stripping themselves bare, revealing that behind the display there was only fear, insecurity, and dependence. And that alone was more devastating than any confrontation I could have staged. And it was in that chaos that something unexpected happened. One day, as I was walking back from the grocery store, I saw a car parked in front of my house. Grace was inside, alone, her eyes full of tears. When she stepped out, I knew a new chapter was about to be written. A few days after the storm, the doorbell rang. I opened the door, and there was Grace. No heavy makeup, no flashy clothes. Just her, simple, with red eyes and trembling hands. Before I could say a word, she hugged me tightly. Not a formal hug, but the kind that says, "Dad, I should have been by your side." In that embrace, I felt something I hadn't felt through all the chaos. Truth. It was as if each of her tears washed away a little of the pain Daniel had caused me. She looked me in the eyes and said, "Dad, I should have defended you at that lunch, but now I understand. You did the right thing. I saw what happened afterward. I saw what arrogance caused. And I know you didn't sell the house out of anger. You sold it out of dignity." Her words were like balm, because deep down, what a father wants most is not an inheritance accepted, nor status acknowledged. It's respect. It's knowing that someone in his own family sees the value that goes beyond money. And Grace, with that simple recognition, gave back to me something I thought I had lost. We talked for hours that afternoon. She told me about the fights at home, about Lily's tears as she watched her parents argue, about the emptiness that had taken over the house that once seemed so grand. And I realized that, even unintentionally, my decision had revealed truths that had been hidden for years. I wasn't the one who destroyed anything. They were the ones who built a life on pillars of arrogance and left respect behind. And now, in the middle of the wreckage, Grace appeared as a bridge. Proof that even in families marked by betrayal and humiliation, something pure can still take root. As she spoke, I felt an emotion that's hard to explain. It was as if a part of me, once broken, was finally being restored. I was no longer just the wounded father, the humiliated man. I was someone who, even in pain, managed to teach. And maybe that's the greatest revenge of all, proving that dignity doesn't depend on other people's recognition, but it can awaken conscience in those who still have an open heart to learn. Grace showed me that my choices were not in vain. When she stood to leave, she hugged me again. "Dad, I don't want to lose you. I want to rebuild our relationship, and I want Lily to grow up knowing what really matters." Those words engraved themselves in me like a tattoo, because in that moment I realized I hadn't lost a house. I hadn't lost a legacy. I had regained something much greater, my own dignity, and the true love of a daughter who chose to open her eyes. And as the door closed behind her, I felt a different kind of peace. Not the peace of someone who won, but the peace of someone who was finally free. Now I want to leave you, Saul, with a question that may sting even more than my story. How many times have you stayed quiet in the face of humiliation within your own family? How many times have you swallowed the pain, pretended everything was fine, just to avoid confronting the lack of respect? And how long do you plan to live that way, invisible, waiting for someone to finally see your worth? Life is too short to waste energy trying to be recognized by those who refuse to see you. Dignity isn't something you beg for, it's something you demonstrate. Respect isn't something you plead for, it's something you earn through action. If I learned anything on this journey, it's that sometimes you have to let go of what hurts in order to gain the freedom to be who you are, without asking permission. And now I'll ask you, what would your decision be if you were in my place? Would you have the courage to flip the table and show, through your actions, that your dignity comes before any inheritance? Or would you remain silent, carrying a burden that was never yours to bear? Write your opinion here in the comments. I want to hear your story too. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because every video here is more than just a story. It's an invitation to reflect on respect, on family, and on how to transform betrayal and humiliation into freedom and strength.